Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you so much to BBRF for this wonderful and humbling honor of the Colvin Award, and thank you to all who are attending here with the interest in the research. I'll be telling you about a program of research that we're doing on the brain in bipolar disorder, and it's especially meaningful for me to be giving this talk at this BBRF Symposium, as most of this work would not be possible if it weren't for BBRF. Much of the work that I'll tell you about, I was able to initiate because I had a NARSAD BBRF Young Investigator Award, and then I was able to grow the research and continue, and then to grow and expand the research, having received a BBRF Independent Investigator Award. And then as the program continued to grow, there were young investigators who joined the group, and their work thrived because they then received Young Investigator Awards, and now they're expanding their own programs. So I'm really particularly delighted to give this talk here today. So this talk will have three different parts to it. In the first part, I'll be talking a little bit about bipolar disorder, and in particular kind of talking about it from the perspective of giving you the ingredients to see kind of what we were thinking about in bipolar disorder to develop a brain model for the disorder. In the second part of the talk, I'll be presenting that brain model, the neurodevelopmental model, as Dr. Hirschfeld was alluding to, and I'll be showing you then images from our brain scanning research. So I'll be providing the evidence for that model. And then third, in the last part of the talk, I'll be talking about some of the new work in which we are expanding the work to try to see what there could be in terms of new clues for new directions for treatment, and also for the prevention of difficult symptoms and the suffering of mood disorders. Okay, so first, to tell you a little bit about some of the symptoms of bipolar disorder, but particularly to be thinking about what symptoms we were thinking about as we tried to build a brain model for bipolar disorder. So, as I have kind of boxed in green, as you know, in the mood disorders, what is central to the mood disorders are more extreme and sustained changes in emotions. So in depression, there's the sadness, the lows of depression. In mania, which is the hallmark for a bipolar disorder diagnosis, there's the elevated mood. And that can be euphoria, or it can be an uncharacteristic irritability. And so these changes in emotions are central to bipolar disorder. So when we're trying to think about a brain model, we think about central to that brain model, the brain circuitry that is involved in regulating emotions. However, and as I've shown on the slide here, also very important to the mood disorders are this other broad range of symptoms. And they span from symptoms that relate to some of the most primitive parts of the brain, key parts of the brain. So ones involved, for example, in sleep and appetite, the hypothalamus I'll tell you about briefly. And you can almost kind of march up the nervous system from these inner, deep, more kind of primitive, essential brain structures, all the way through to the outside of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in some of the most high order or executive functions of the brain, which can also be affected in bipolar disorder. And so if we're going to build a brain model for bipolar disorder, we need one that can account for this kind of centrality of emotional dysregulation, but then also for this broad range of symptoms. Here I have kind of an illustration of a squished kind of a life course of bipolar disorder untreated. So just one type of example. And what I have going along horizontally is age. Going up is higher manic symptoms, going down more depressed symptoms. And what you can see in this potential example is that before puberty, maybe there were already some symptoms, maybe there were lower symptoms or not recognized to be symptoms of a mood disorder, but then around puberty or after, which is often the case, now a mood disorder is starting to declare itself. And that is often with depressive symptoms. Untreated, there can be an increase in the severity and the frequency of the episodes. So a goal for us with treatment is to try to decrease the severity of the episodes and their frequency so that someone can go on to do everything that they wish to do in life. And what I'll allude to as well and come back to themes about is that bipolar disorder can have this progressive aspect. And so one of the focus of our program is to try to figure out ways to intervene, to prevent this progression, and to improve prognosis. Bipolar disorder is also associated with a high risk of suicide. As many as 50% of individuals with bipolar disorder may attempt suicide, and it's been estimated that as high as 10 or 15 to 20% will lose their lives to suicide. Suicidal thoughts and behaviors often develop at similar times that we start to see bipolar disorder express itself in the teenage and adolescent years. And so it kind of goes, our studying the changes in the adolescent brain in bipolar disorder kind of go hand in hand with our studying how suicide thoughts and behaviors develop. But I think in some ways the most important part of this slide is that we already have evidence, particularly in adults, that treatments can help to lower the risk for suicide. Most of the studies have been primarily with lithium and in adults, but I think taken together with the idea that if we can prevent the episodes and the progression, we can really improve prognosis and someone can go on to live the life that they like to live in whatever way they would like, and that we could also decrease not just the suffering, but also this risk of suicide really drives us in our work to try to go as fast as we can to find some answers. Okay, so towards that, I'll tell you some about the brain model that we have for bipolar disorder. And so when we first started out, and Dr. Hirschfeld mentioned that initially I was in New York, not too far from here, at Cornell, then just Cornell, now Weill Cornell. And in trying to think about this, when there weren't quite yet, or they were just emerging, the tools to be able to look inside the brain of someone actually experiencing symptoms, we turned to neurology or behavioral neurology to see, for example, if someone had a lesion in the brain, had had a stroke or brain trauma, where that lesion was that might lead to symptoms of bipolar disorder. And in fact, there had been descriptions since at least the 1800s of individuals who had had lesions in their brain, particularly in the frontal part of their brain, and particularly in this lower part I'll be referring to, the ventral prefrontal part of the brain. And interestingly, there was also a laterality to it. And so individuals who had lesions on the left, in the left hemisphere, tended to get depressed, whereas if they were going to get manic after an injury, often the lesion was on the right. And there's an idea that in the brain, and evidence for this, that there's some difference in which side of the brain, which hemisphere, more processes negative or positive emotions. So the idea, for example, is that In the right hemisphere, negative emotions are processed more. So if you have a lesion, a problem, or lower activity in the right side, you kind of have a release or an exaggeration of the emotions of the other side. And I'll go back to that, but for now, potentially remember, that would predict that in mania, in bipolar disorder, we would see decreases in right and particularly ventral prefrontal cortex. So here is an illustration of the brain I'll keep going back to. The brain is aligned the same way that I'm standing, and it's cut then right down the middle. And here in the front is the frontal cortex. And again, this lower part we call the ventral prefrontal cortex. I have it colored here in a cool blue color with the reminder that often what we saw early on were particularly related to mania, were decreases in activity. That's what we were predicting. Also very important, these structures work within circuits. It's also very important in this circuit. Key in this circuit is a structure called the amygdala. And that's a structure, this is the temporal lobe of the brain. It's a structure deep in the temporal lobe. It's named after the Greek word for almond, thus amygdala. And as I alluded to, structures that are deeper in the brain tend to be more, process more basic or primitive functions. So the amygdala has a more kind of basic role in emotional reactions to different kinds of stimuli. In contrast, now the folded executive prefrontal cortex helps to take in all sorts of information and then feed back to the amygdala to allow for the most adaptive responses. And so I've got them now colored here, the amygdala in red, because I think it's a hot area in bipolar disorder with elevated activity, and then the cool blue frontal cortex. And then importantly, we're thinking more and more about the connections between the two. And so there are major connections between ventral prefrontal cortex and amygdala, and those are inhibitory. And that's often how the brain works, is that higher order structures like the frontal cortex will think about things and then try to put the brakes on other areas, reactive areas of the brain, to help for behavior to be more adaptive. And so knowing that, you can kind of imagine that you could wind up with this pattern of higher amygdala, lower prefrontal cortex, either through a problem in the amygdala, a problem in the ventral prefrontal cortex, or a problem in the connections. And I'll be showing you examples of all three of those in the talk. I just want to also say I'm going to be very focused on those areas, but there are many more widespread connections that are very important and distributed in the brain. So for example, I mentioned the hypothalamus, amygdala and ventral prefrontal cortex, highly connected to the hypothalamus. And that's important because the hypothalamus is important in sleep, appetite, sex drives, all affected in mood disorders. And perhaps you can kind of imagine if you have problems in that core emotional circuitry, amygdala, prefrontal, and its connections, that you could also have consequences also in hypothalamus and the regulation of those other kind of functions. Other parts of the brain are involved, and Dr. Phillips in particular will be talking about ventral striatum and its connections in motivated behavior in the talk that follows mine. So I'll be showing you, for the most part, data from MRI scanning. That's a picture of our MRI scanner. It's pretty similar to an MRI scanner if you went for clinical reasons to get an MRI scan. It's a little bit stronger, and we use very particular kinds of computer algorithms to obtain and to analyze the data. And I'll be showing you 3 different types of data that we get in one scanning session. So first, we get high-resolution structural scans, so we can see the size and the shape of brain structures and their volume. Second, we get functional scans. So we can look at brain activity. We can see what brain activity is in a particular region, and also how brain regions work together in a brain circuit. And then finally, we can get something called diffusion tensor imaging, where we can actually look at the structural integrity of those connections, those white matter-coded connections. So when we began this work, this is the only slide that I will show you that's not fMRI. This is positron emission tomography and back from the New York days. But this was particularly exciting to us, as this was one of the first times there was a look inside the brain of someone with bipolar disorder while they were experiencing manic symptoms. And indeed, what we saw was that there was decreased activity in the frontal lobe, and it was also on the right. I'll keep flipping brains around, and I know that looks like it's on the left, but that's actually on the right side of the brain. So consistent with our hypotheses. I then went to Yale, it's been almost 20 years now, and began the work with MRI, and we saw some of the same findings, new subjects, new techniques. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be flipping around in the brain a little bit, but here's the brain the way we had before. If you can kind of imagine a slice of the brain this way, then on these pictures, this is the frontal part of the brain. And so what we saw again in mania were decreases in the right. We then saw differences in depression on the left. And then, again, all this work is in adults now. We also saw some decreases in this part of the brain in adults with bipolar disorder when they weren't experiencing acute mood symptoms of the disorder, suggesting maybe there's something about some difficulties in ventral prefrontal cortex that makes them vulnerable to having the mood states. So how could we get there from a neurodevelopmental point of view? And so when we started out with our hypotheses, one of the things that I was very interested in is that the brain doesn't all develop, all parts of the brain don't develop at the same time, don't fully mature at the same time, right? The structures in the brain that are deep, that are important in very basic functions, it's very important for them to develop and mature early, because those functions are very essential to life. But then those later to evolve parts of the brain that have those more executive roles that take in much more complex information, those are later to mature and continue to mature in adolescence and adulthood. So the thought that we had, so here first, for example, in amygdala, in this deep region of the brain, this is sort of cartooning it, but compared to prefrontal cortex, there's relative stability in the amygdala in terms of its volume by after puberty, in contrast to prefrontal cortex, where before puberty, there's the sprouting and the growing of neuronal connections, and then after puberty, the pruning back or the decreasing of those connections in the service of more adaptive and refined behavioral responses. And so what we wondered then is, would we see this kind of sequence of emergence of the brain differences in bipolar disorder that parallel the sequence of development? And so we hypothesized then that in amygdala, we might already be able to detect differences in the amygdala by adolescence. Whereas in the frontal cortex, there might be a progressive divergence in the structure and function of the frontal cortex over adolescence and young adulthood, so that we'd really see the most exaggerated differences and ones that are typical of adults not fully emerge, not fully manifest until young adulthood. And this idea is important in the sense that if there's this progression of differences, and this is and adolescence, for example, is one critical period, and you'll be hearing a lot about critical periods in the talks today, then it's very important for us to be able to identify the risks, things that could steer this development off course, these trajectories off course, early life stress, substance abuse, and other potential things that steer it further off course that we need to prevent. But also, we're learning more and more about how plastic the brain is and how to help enhance brain plasticity. And that brings tremendous hope that we're going to be able to find ways to help to steer the trajectory back on track to improve prognosis. Okay, so to show you some of the data, again, the amygdala, where we're hypothesizing early abnormalities. And so we saw in amygdala are decreases in the volume in bipolar disorder, and indeed we saw it in adolescents as well as in adults. We also saw that red-hot amygdala, the increases in the responses of the amygdala to emotional stimuli, and those were correlated such that those who had the smallest amygdala had the most excessive responses, and that gives us some clues about what might be happening in the amygdala, and we're now following that up at ultra-high magnetic field research that we've started to do at Yale. Frontal cortex, in terms of development, where we thought we might see progression, that's indeed what we saw. So what you can see here, in ventral prefrontal volume, some decreases in adolescence, but larger decreases by young adulthood. And then these images in two different samples of adolescents and young adults who were studied over time with repeated scans. We saw greater decreases over time in those areas of frontal cortex in the adolescents with bipolar disorder than the adolescents without. So what about the connections? That's some of the newer work that we're doing. And there are some implications that those connections that grow from amygdala to prefrontal cortex, that some of the differences in those connections may be present, but may also be progressing. And just a note about changes with development in the white matter. So again, the reminder about the gray matter changes. The white matter changes seem to occur for a longer period of time. So seem to continue to be increasing into the 40s, for example. And so there may even be longer periods of opportunity to make a change in that development of the connections. And we're interested both in those developmental changes, and then I won't be talking so much about today, but we're also interested in thinking about the aging processes that occur after that peak. So we used diffusion tensor imaging that can help us look at the connections. We saw the decreases in some of the structural integrity of these white matter connections in adults. We also saw decreases in the ability of the functional connections of the nodes of the circuit to work well together in adults. We're also seeing that in the adolescents, and in some of our recent data, we're seeing that although some of those differences seem to be present in the adolescents, they do seem to be progressing during the adolescent young adult period. Just a word about suicide. I won't be as focused in this talk on it. That's an increasingly important part of our program. We're very dedicated to that work. And indeed, we're seeing some higher magnitude of some of these changes in the adolescents and young adults who make suicide attempts. And in some very early work, we're seeing that some of those differences may be predictive of, we've followed adolescents now for 6 and 7 years. The ones who have the highest magnitude of those differences may be the ones who are more likely to go on to make attempts, and that would be very important as a clue for prevention. Okay, so in this very last part of the talk, I just kind of want to touch on some of the directions we're going. So we have some of these places to look in terms of the circuitry and how it might develop. And what we now want to do is understand the different mechanisms, genetic and environmental, that can lead to a cascade of events that ultimately result in these differences in circuitry and the symptoms. And I think as Dr. Kelly talked about in her talk, we're all kind of hoping, and I think the future is very hopeful, that we're moving in a direction towards more personalized treatment approaches, so that if you can start to understand how if someone has a certain combination of genes, because in different individuals with bipolar disorder, there may be different combinations of genes, maybe ones that run in families, that if you have a particular combination of genes and particular brain changes and symptoms, then maybe there are ways to target that individual's biology, that individual's makeup, to help to best treat them, and also towards the question that was asked earlier, to also potentially avoid treatments that would not be helpful for them and avoid those side effects. So this is just very quickly showing that we've initiated work looking at different genetic variations implicated in bipolar disorder, and we are seeing that the risk variations are related to some of the differences in the brain that we're seeing, so some clues about genetic effects. And then also you'll be hearing much more about this type of work later, but we've also looked, for example, at early child maltreatment, abuse, or neglect, emotional or physical, and we also are seeing some overlap in the changes in the brain as we see in the mood disorders, and wonder about the potential of those two contributing to some of the brain differences or worsening or differences in the expression of the disorder. In terms of treatment, as mentioned, there's evidence that mood stabilizing treatments can help to grow nerve cells, potentially reverse these processes. Very early work suggests that medication may be able to reverse these processes. Here's ventral prefrontal gray matter, no mood stabilizer, higher on mood stabilizer. Here is ventral prefrontal functioning, off medication, on medication, here lithium. And the hope is that we'll also learn ways to use these treatments to prevent progression. And one in particular that we've just started to do and we're very excited about is trying to use psychobehavioral types of therapies, ones where we teach healthy habits, regularizing sleep, daily activity, helping to train adolescents to better regulate their emotions. And we hope and we have some very preliminary evidence that that can help to strengthen the circuitry and potentially help with some of the symptoms. So what I've tried to show you is there's kind of a light on some of the areas that we think are now important in bipolar disorder. We have some different developmental processes that we're now thinking about in terms of targeting treatments, medication, but also behavioral treatments. For all of this research, as alluded to, it takes a village. For all of this, I'm very grateful to my collaborators. As mentioned, the central importance of the funding of BBRF and NARSAD, as well as under other funding sources. Thank you.
Great talk. Yeah, we've got time for maybe one or two questions if we can turn out the lights. Yes, sir. Yeah, oh.
I was wondering if you can answer the questions that I find, in spite of the fact that there was a big debate before the DSM-5 whether we should retain the term bipolar or manic depressive illness. Goodwin and Jamison's book, put them together. I find, in spite of the step-leading large New England study, that the so-called SSRI antidepressants are not useful, might even worsen the course of progression in bipolar. I was wondering if you can comment on recurring depressions, unipolar depressions versus bipolar. Is this the same illness with slight differences, or is it completely different because the treatment implications also?
Yep. So if I understand the question is recurrent depression, major depressive disorder. So you have bipolar disorder with recurrent mood episodes. You have depression, major depression with recurrent mood disorders. Do we think of those as separate illnesses or similar illnesses, or, or along a spectrum of the same illnesses, and that could potentially have treatment implications, whether you pick certain classes of medications that might make things better or worse. And so that's a very interesting and a very, a topic that is being vigorously studied and really needs study. And it's interesting because there are different thoughts about it internationally. So even if in Europe, often there's more thinking that MDD and bipolar disorder are actually, kind of along, more similar. And there are medications that can be similarly helpful in both. For example, lithium can be helpful in both disorders, often used a little bit differently, but used, for mood stabilization in bipolar disorder, but often to help in major depressive disorder, which some of the most, intractable to treat depressions. And we also have individuals who have just manic episodes, that are kind of in the middle of the, we have individuals who have one episode, many episodes. And so I think, you point well to, there's so much heterogeneity in the disorders, and we need so much to get better at understanding that heterogeneity. One of the things with some of that genetic work, for example, that we're trying to do is to try to see if we see that the genes are associated with certain particular changes in the brain, that maybe, and then that's associated with a particular course. And I think you bring up an important point, not just a cross-sectional view of the disorder, but a course of the disorder, that then maybe we can get better at targeting those genes to better help with that particular course that they're related to.
Just one more quick question. We got some great things coming up. Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So you did answer my question.
Well, go ahead. Give us your question, and we'll.
I was wondering, you said you do see situations where there's just mania versus and no depression. Is that unusual, or is that?
So you can. So the.
How is that treated?
So the question is whether you, since I mentioned that you can sometimes see just manias, you don't necessarily see depressions, is that usual? So it is the case that depressions are the more frequent episodes overall in bipolar disorder, but that said, it's very individual. And you can see, not only can you see, just mania or just, depression, but also you could see in individuals, humans love dichotomies, but often you see really a mixture of the symptoms. And that's a very common presentation. So someone is sort of a mixture of maybe they're feeling really dysphoric and terrible, but they're really energized. And so they can have so you kind of see all these combinations. One thing that's interesting is there can be some sex differences. So women are more likely to have depressive episodes and males manic episodes. Is there something to that? And so you're raising a very important question. It seems also to be, really an important theme of this conference is, the trying to sort out this heterogeneity, where it stems from, and then how to target those factors, either through prevention or with better treatments.